optical microscope and the problems of resolution, how to improve the resolution, and we started talking about how the contrast comes in an optical microscope. And in that connection, we said you need to prepare your sample, and we talked about what it means called polishing, and what is the necessity of making a surface very flat. If the surface is rough, you will not be able to see the contrast. The reason is, on a rough surface, if the surface is rough like this, if the light falls on this, it gets reflected. If the light falls on this, it goes. As a result, you will not be able to see. You will see dark and white regions definitely. But those dark and white regions are not the microstructure of your sample, but they are only the roughness on your surface. And your interest of using a microscope is to see the microstructural features of your sample. I want to see the perlite and the ferrite. I want to see the precipitate in my microstructure. And I want to know how big is this precipitate or how small is this precipitate. So I do not want to see whether there is a roughness on the surface. And if that is your intention, if your intention is to see the microstructural features, you should only get a contrast from only the microstructural features and nothing else. And in order to achieve that, you need to have a surface which has as less roughness as possible. And the whole polishing concept comes from removing the roughness as much as possible and making it as flat as possible, okay, with minimal roughness. And that is what is achieved by polishing. And once you do that, I am able to see some features, as I just mentioned, about some inclusions, but you will not be able to actually see the microstructural features. For example, if my interest is in a pure aluminum, I want to see the grain size. I have taken two samples of aluminum. For example, I have taken a liquid of aluminum, poured it into a metal mold, and poured also into a sand mold. And both of them are, let's say, cylinders like this. And I cut this cylinder and then want to look at it from top with a circular cross section. Now one is a metal mold and another is a sand mold. Casting obtained from these two. And I definitely know that the grain size that I get from these two will not be the same. Right? Which one will give me a smaller grain size? Metal mold. Can somebody tell me why? Cooling rates will be faster. So what? How does the cooling rate influence the grain size? Restricted. Okay. Anything beyond that? Anybody else who wants to add? It is actually not the grain growth per se. There is something else. Why a metal mold gives you finer? If you know your physical metallurgy, well, anybody else? It has something to do with nucleation. Now can you tell me? Nucleation during solidification, is it influenced by cooling rate? Now tell me, how is it influenced by cooling? If I give you the answer, you will say, yes sir, I know it. More, yeah, you are saying something. More, undercooling. If I cool it fast, the undercooling is higher. Okay, nucleation rate is higher. When I cool a liquid faster, it does not solidify at the melting point, but gets cooled below the melting point because you are not providing time for it to start solidifying at the melting point. So because there is an inertia in every system. If you want, what is the meaning of nucleation? Nucleation means atoms have to come together and form a critical size called R star. Unless an R star forms, nucleation is not complete. For the R star to form, you need atoms to come together. You need to provide some time for the atoms to come together and form that R star. If you are not providing that time, then the liquid continues to cool down below the melting point until a particular temperature where the R star has formed, okay, where the nucleation has happened. And this is what is the concept of different cooling rates. If I use a slower cooling rate, the solidification happens near the melting point, not at the melting point. Solidification does not start at the melting point usually, because you definitely need some undercooling. Why do you need definitely some undercooling? Why does aluminum does not solidify at 660 melting point? What is the problem? I bring a liquid aluminum to 660 degrees, which is supposed to be the melting point of aluminum. Why does the solid does not form at that temperature? Why do I need to cool it below 660? Yes, tell it out. You may be wrong. There is nothing wrong in being wrong, but at the same time you may be right also. So please tell me. No idea? Yes, why do we need to cool a liquid below a particular temperature? For it to solidify. I'm sorry I keep deviating from the main topic, but it's important because everything is connected. Yes. No answer? Because at the melting point, the driving force is 0. Delta G is 0 at the melting point. What is melting point? G of liquid equal to G of solid. That's the definition of melting point. The free energy of both the phases is equal. And when the free energy of both the phases are equal, then there is no solidification. Solidification will happen only when there is a driving force. And to achieve a driving force, you need to cool it below the melting point so that at a temperature below the melting point, the solid has a lower free energy. If I plot the free energy versus temperature, you must have seen curves like this. That below the melting point, this is called the melting point. Below the melting point, solid has a lower free energy than the liquid. And as a result, there is a driving force. This is what we call it as delta. So I need to come below the melting point for the solidification to happen. But if I come below the melting point to a larger extent by cooling it rapidly, then I say I have more undercooling. This is called undercooling. All of you know this. The higher the undercooling, the faster the nucleation. Because the nucleation rate, which is called I, is usually defined as some number pre-exponential term. Have you seen this? And this delta G star is given as, for a spherical nucleus, what kind of a formula? What is the activation barrier for nucleation for a spherical nucleus? 4 pi r cube. Are you sure? No, I am asking you what is delta G star? Delta G star, which is the activation energy. You are telling me how to derive the delta G star. You are right, but that is not the final answer. Please sit down. Do you know the answer? What is the delta G star? Delta G star is delta G at R star. If you remember this is what is delta G star. Yes, yes. Yes, yes. Yeah. What is that value? 16 pi by 3 gamma cube, and this delta GV is where delta HF is heat of fusion and TF is melting point. I mean, you can call it as TM or TF. It's the same. Melting, fusion, all the same. Okay. So and you can see now that this particular equation has this in it. Okay. So the larger the driving force, the higher the driving force. I mean, the driving force basically coming from higher. How the higher driving force? As I increase the delta T, the driving force is increasing. Driving force is difference between these two. The difference between these two keeps on increasing as you decrease the temperature or increase the undercooling, and that basically increases the driving force. That causes a decrease in the delta G star, and if the delta G star decreases, I increases. Of course, there is a limitation on this. This happens only up to certain temperature. Below that, undercooling. You all know that there is another influence that comes. What is the other influence? Anybody knows? I cannot extrapolate this. Keep on extrapolating, saying that as I have more and more undercooling, my nucleation rate will keep on increasing. In fact, the nucleation rate decreases at higher undercoolings. Diffusivity comes into picture, and that's the reason why we say for what is called austenite to Ferrite transmission, we talk about a C curve. The same C curve can be talked about for liquid to solid also. Any diffusion based reaction will always have that C curve. That means you will see that there is a limit up to which the driving force influences, beyond which the diffusivity influences. So until then, I can say a metal mold gives me finer grains than sand. And if I want to see that, it gives finer grains basically because of two reasons. One is the I is higher if the delta T is higher. Of course, up to the, if I draw the C curve, up to at least the C curve, you can see in this domain, as the delta T increases, this is my TM, let us say, this is a liquid becoming a solid. I can say that within this domain, as the delta T increases, then definitely I increases. Not only I increases, something else also happens. Anything else happens as the delta T increases? Anything related to R star? What happens to R star? R star increases with the increasing delta T. What is the formula for R star? No, again the same problem. Can you tell me at the center? 2 gamma by delta G. That's it. 2 gamma by delta G. And because the delta G is this equation, you can see R star is inversely proportional to delta T, right? So the R star decreases as delta T increases. Again within that domain. If I come below that, I cannot use this. There are difficulties. The reason is for at very small temperatures, for the R star to form also you need atoms to come together. Atoms do not want to move much. As a result, you will not be able to see. So now you can see there are two things. One is the size of the nucleus is decreasing. That means you have smaller and smaller nuclei. And the number of nuclei are increasing. I is increasing. So that means if I compare two delta T's, one a smaller delta T, another is a larger delta T. In the case of larger delta T, you have small nuclei and more number of the small nuclei. If you consider bigger delta T, a smaller delta T, that means temperature very close to the melting point, or another, if this is, for example, T1, if this is T2, that means delta T1 and delta T2. Delta T2 being larger than delta T1. In case of delta T1, you have a bigger R star, because you can see as the delta T is smaller, then R star is larger. So whenever you consider the undercooling, smaller undercooling, you have bigger nuclei and smaller in number, because I also will be smaller. And if I consider a case where you have higher undercooling, then you have smaller nuclei, larger in number. And that's how you get a fine grain structure. So why a metal mold gives you fine grain structure is basically because of that. And now the problem why I am saying this is I would like to see these sizes in a microscope. And to see them, what I need to do is do something else. Just polishing is not going to be sufficient. What I need to do is what we call it as etching. Etching is nothing but selective dissolution using a chemical, mostly acids. Okay, because acids have tendency to dissolve metals. So if I put a thin layer of an acid on my surface, on the surface of the sample, it dissolves. But this dissolution happens selectively, and it tries to dissolve those regions which have a higher energy faster than those regions which have a lower energy. That is where the energy comes into picture. And if I look at a sample with some grains like this, it has, let's say, grains. If it is a sample like this kind of grains. This sample, wherever there is a grain boundary touching the surface, top surface, grain boundary is like a surface, right? But the surface, when it is cut by a flat region, it is like a line, right? So whenever that line touches the top surface, and in that particular region, this energy is higher. Why the grain boundaries have high energy? Why the grain boundaries have high energy? Anybody who wants to tell me why the grain boundaries have high energy? You all know that it has high energy, right? But why? This is the problem, because you possibly have never asked your teacher why. Yes, it is not really non-crystallinity, very close to that. And atoms inside the grain have a periodic arrangement of atoms. Similarly, this grain also has again periodic arrangement of atoms. Excepting that, if I am considering, let's say, a particular plane, let us call it as a 111 plane. If this is 111 plane, the same 111 plane in this grain will be at a certain angle to this. It will not be at the same continuation. The moment you talk of a grain boundary, we say that at the grain boundary there is a orientation difference. How does this come? Because different grains which have nucleated, each grain is nothing but a single crystal. A nucleated single crystal, they are all nucleated inside the liquid, they are all growing, and the moment they come and touch each other, you form a grain boundary. And this grain boundary because the atoms are oriented in a particular direction in this particular grain and in another orientation in this grain, they both, when they meet, you form a boundary. If they both have the same orientation, you don't form a boundary at all. It will be a continuous. The fact that you have a boundary always indicates that there is a difference in the orientation. The moment there is a difference in the orientation, automatically the atoms sitting at the grain boundary, which has a certain thickness, every boundary will have certain thickness, a few nanometer thickness usually has, and that particular region, even a few nanometer is too much. In fact, if I can ask you this question, people talk about nanomaterials nowadays. If I give you 1 nanometer, let's say a particle of any metal, let's say aluminum, can you guess how many atoms can be there? I tell you the interatomic distance, let's say in aluminum, is 1 angstrom, let us say. I'll give you a certain number, 1 angstrom as the interatomic distance. And I have a particle which has a radius, diameter of 1 nanometer. How many atoms I can expect in this part? Rough number. Can somebody tell me? The distance between any 2 atoms is 1 angstrom. Any 2 neighboring atoms is 1 angstrom. And the particle size is 1 nanometer. What is the connection between nanometer and angstroms? I am asking you, what is the connection between nanometer and angstrom? Don't tell me 10 to the power 9 and all those things. What is the connection between these two? How much of a nanometer is equal to how much of an angstrom? Nobody knows? Yes, friend. Let me repeat. I am asking you how many nanometers equal to how many angstroms? Is it 10 to the power 9? This is where when we don't connect things happens. Yes, 1 angstrom is equal to 0.1 nanometer. Correct. Who said this? Whoever. That is correct. So 1 nanometer equal to 10 angstroms. Now I have given you all the data that is required for you. Now tell me how many atoms can be expected in one particle with about 1 nanometer diameter. If you say it is difficult for me, sir, to find out if it is a spherical particle, so I would say I am giving you a cube of 1 nanoparticle with the length of the cube being 1 nanometer. Now let me see if you can do this easily. It's not a spherical particle. Let's say it's a cube of a nanoparticle with the dimension of 1 nanometer. How many atoms? 10 atoms. I want you to be a little more smarter. Yes, at least one soul here. You are all school toppers, right? I don't want school toppers to be like this. Yes. Yes, nobody has an answer? Yeah. Give me some numbers. Throw some numbers. I will not remember your face and catch you later. No, tell me some number. 4? 4? Somebody said 10? Any other numbers? No? Is the question clear? Let's assume that I have a box, a cube of box with the atoms inside, and the distance between atoms is 1 angstrom, and the size of the box is 1 nanometer. Now how many atoms are there inside the box is my question. And somebody says 4, somebody says 10, and I don't get any other number. That's it. No other numbers? Is it such a difficult question? You are complicating everything. Yes. 6. Anybody who has any other number? It is 1. That's the problem. There is no point in giving the answer to your friend. I want the answer from you. So it is 1000. Because in one dimension, okay, of 1 nanometer, because I am saying the distance between atoms is 1 angstrom, you have 10 atoms in one direction. And we are talking of a volume, 10 into 10 into 10. That is what it is. Of course, the exact number will not be that. That's why I said it's a rough number. You should then ask me, sir, how closely packed these atoms are. Okay? There are further questions that comes. And if you are serious, we can answer all those. We can actually accurately calculate that. But rough number is 1000. So what I am saying is 1 nanometer is not a small thing. A particle of, if I have a dust particle coming out of a chalk piece having a 1 nanometer size, and if the molecules inside are such that the intermolecular distance, if it is 10 nanometer, if it is 1 angstrom, then you will have 1000 molecules inside that particular 1 nanometer particle. And if I have a grain boundary thickness of the order of 2 or 3 nanometers, you can imagine in that sheet of the grain boundary, you will have so many atoms. And these atoms neither belong to grain 1 nor belong to grain 2. And as a result, they are in a no man's land. And because they are in a no man's land, okay, they do not belong to neither that crystal nor this crystal. That's why, as she says, they are like amorphous. There is a set of certain level of randomness there. Of course, there are so many people who have talked about what is the actual structure of grain boundary. People actually talked about, can we talk about certain unit cell inside the grain boundary, including my own professor, Professor Ranganathan from Indian Institute of Science. He has given a new concept called coincident site lattice, which is very popularly nowadays used. He is the first person in this world to have given a new concept called CSL, called coincident site lattice, which is a concept which is used nowadays to understand the grain boundary structure. Does grain boundary have a structure at all? So generally people assume that the grain boundary to have that kind of a randomness, which is not the same as that in the grain. In the grain, if you think there is a complete periodicity, and in the grain boundary you don't have that kind of a periodicity. As a result, the atoms inside the grain boundary are at a high energy state, because they are not periodically arranged. And as a result, this region is at a high energy state when compared to this region. As a result, when I put an acid dissolves this region, and as a result, what you see is a groove formed at the grain boundary. The moment you have a grain boundary, there is a groove formed there. The metal gets dissolved. And once the groove formed, when a light now falls, here the light gets reflected, but when a light falls here, it gets reflected out. It does not reach your eyepiece through the objective, and as a result, that region looks black. And that is the reason why all grain boundaries look black to you. Not only grain boundaries look black, there are some cases where when I look at a sample with certain grains in it, if you have ever seen any metal, pure metal sample, let's say copper or aluminum or something like that, you would have seen that each of these grains will not have the same shade, same gray level. Some look very bright, some look darker grains. Some look somewhere between the bright and dark with various shades. Where are these shades coming from? The grain boundary being black, I understand. The grain itself, why all grains do not have the same brightness? Why some of them are brighter, why some of them are darker? The reason is again, the surface now, if I look at this, which is facing this board, which is what is my top surface, where the light is falling, will not have the same plane. For example, if I look at this sample as again like this, where the light is falling, and I have certain grain boundaries, grain 1, grain 2, grain 3, the plane, atomic plane which is parallel to the surface in grain 1 cannot be the same of the plane which is parallel to the surface here. If it is same, we don't call them as two grains. The difference between two grains is that the orientation is different. So if 111 plane is parallel to the top surface, 111 plane cannot be parallel to the top surface in grain 2. It will be some other plane, 110 or 100, whatever it is. Similarly, grain 3. Now if you look at it, every plane has a certain energy. Where is that coming from? If you look at atomic arrangements in each of the plane, there are different planes with different packing factors. Okay, you can talk about packing factor of a plane. Yesterday in the class we talked about 111 plane in FCC having the highest packing density, closest packed plane we say, with a packing density of 91%. And not all planes have similar packing densities. Now if I look at a plane with other planes parallel to it, the atoms which are sitting in this plane, they have atoms below it, but they don't have atoms above it. because it's the top surface, no atoms above it. That means it has certain broken bonds. It has any atom on the surface here has bonds with this atom, but it does not have bond with anything on top. Every atom in a unit cell has certain coordination number. What is this coordination number? What do we define coordination number as? Number of nearest neighbors. Okay? Number of nearest neighbors for any atom in a unit cell. For example, we say in FCC it has 12. In BCC we say it has 8. Right? So the 12 comes actually in an FCC because there are 6 atoms on that plane, 3 atoms below and 3 atoms above. That is how 12 comes in an FCC. So those 3 atoms above are not there now because it's a top surface. So you only have atoms in that plane and you have atoms below, you don't have atoms above. So that means out of these 12 bonds, 3 bonds are broken. So that means this particular atom sitting on the surface will have a higher energy when compared to an atom which is sitting in the center, inside the material. Because now this atom has all the atoms around it. All the 12 nearest neighbors are there. So it is in a low energy state. Whenever they have all the 12 neighbors around it, it is bonded with all the 12 neighbors, it is in a low energy state. If it does not have some atoms with which it can bond, it is in a high energy state. We call it as an excited state. So these atoms are in an excited state, and as a result it has certain energy. So all the atoms on the surface have certain energy, and this energy will be different from different planes, depending on whatever is the coordination number of that unit cell and depending on whatever is the packing density of that particular plane. If it has more packing density, that means the tendency that more broken bonds are there per unit area is going to be higher. Surface energy is always energy per unit area, right? So this surface energy for 111 plane will be different from 100 plane and 110 plane, and it will be different for different unit cells. If it is BCC, it will be different. So 111 of BCC will have certain surface energy, 111 of FCC will have some other surface energy. Now as a result, I can say that these 3 grains will have, the surfaces have 3 different surface energies. And as a result, if I now put an acid on it, depending on the energy of that particular surface, it eats away that particular region differently. The region which has a higher surface energy will be eaten away more, and it forms a kind of a dimple here. And whichever has a very low surface energy, it does not eat it away. So it remains flat. And as a result, you see these regions which are brighter. Wherever the acid or the etchant has not eaten it away, it looks bright because it is flat, the light is getting reflected easily, and wherever it has eaten it away, there is a dent, and as a result when the light is falling, it is, though it is reaching, but it is reaching at an angle, and as a result it looks certain grayish in light. And this is how even the concept of, for example, if I look at a perlite, in a perlite you see, if I look at perlite as a cross, okay, you will have ferrite, cementite, Fe3C, this is Fe3C. If I consider these as Fe3C walls and this as alpha, this is the cross section, and if I see from the top looks like, from the top if I look at it, these the cementite look like this. And these are basically nothing but those walls of cementite, and when I look at this and polish it and etch it, when I polish it, incidentally you will see the cementite being harder, it does not get polished as easily as ferrite. So what you see is this region will have some protrusion. I mean, I am exaggerating too much, but it is almost like that. If I magnify, you will see the cementite walls being protruding out, and this regions when I etch also, I see the cementite being a compound. Compounds do not get dissolved very easily because compounds have very high bond strength. Okay, they are strongly, iron and carbon are strongly bonded, so they usually do not dissolve very easily. And as a result, when I have now a light falling on this surface, it gets reflected more easily. But when the light falls onto an inclined wall like this, there is a chance that it gets reflected. And also a shadow of this can fall on this, see that particular cementite alone will look black, though it is protruding out. As I showed you earlier, in an inclusion which is protruding out looks black. Similarly here, the perlite, the cementite which is protruding out of the perlite will look black. So this is how we can be able to see. So the whole concept of contrast in an optical microscope is coming only because of depth differences. Okay, something which is flat looks bright, something which is deeper like a crevice will look black. This has to be remembered, because when we go to another microscope called an electron microscope, the whole contrast theory is slightly different. We'll come to it a little later. So you need to understand that this is how we will be able to see various features, and with this we will be able to understand what kind of features can be seen. So without etching, you will not be able to see a microstructure. And once I see the microstructure, I will be able to see what are all the phases that are present, the amount of the phases that I can see. And in this context, we have to talk about what is called quantitative metallography. So far we said I can see phases. I can see perlite, I can see ferrite, I can see the cementite inside the perlite. All this is fine for me. Can I quantify it? Is the next question. For example, if I have two metals, metal which is, as I said earlier, solidified in let's say a sand mold and a metallic mold, and I know that the grain sizes are different, can I quantify this and say that this particular casting has this grain size in terms of certain microns of grain diameter, and other casting has some other grain size? Can we quantify? And this whole thing of quantifying the microstructure, when I say quantifying, what are the things that I can quantify? I can quantify a grain size. If there are precipitates, I can talk about precipitate particle size. I can even quantify the shape and talk about aspect ratio. For example, bainite. We know bainite has an acicular structure, right? So we should be able to talk if there are needles. Okay, how long are these needles? What is the ratio between the length and the breadth of this needle? Can we talk about it? Which is called aspect ratio. So the shape and the aspect ratios of them. And then can we also talk about fraction of? Of course, I would like to know the size distribution also. Not just the size. When I say size, not all grains will have the same size. It is next to impossible to find all grains of the same size. The reason is, even if I am talking of solidification, solidification is composed of two features, two I would say events. One is nucleation, another is a growth, right? If all nuclei have formed at time t equal to 0, and they are all growing isotropically in all directions, then you will see that in the casting all grains will have the same. So this is a very, very idealistic situation. It doesn't happen. There is always something called a transient nucleation. That means some nuclei form at some regions and they start growing, and while these start growing, the nuclei can form at some other regions. In a liquid to solid, this is more difficult to understand if it is particularly homogeneous nucleation, but if it is heterogeneous nucleation, it is not very difficult to understand. Because if it is heterogeneous nucleation, depending on what are the heterogeneous nucleating sites that are there, some of the heterogeneous sites may be more potent nucleating sites, because whether some particle which you are adding as a heterogeneous nucleating site is a good nucleating site or not, depends on what? Yes, depends on what? Yeah, which particle? I add two particles. Okay, which one is can act as a better nucleating site than the other? Depends on what? Yeah, that's true. But my question is, what decides whether it is faster or not? Yeah, but you are not going deeper. This is what I call it as surface engineering. So you are still on the surface. My question is, why does two particles, particle A, particle B, added to the same liquid, particle A acts as a better nucleating site than particle B? What decides that? Position? Inside the liquid, what does position mean? You are talking of liquid, madam. Volume of the particle, bigger particle, smaller particle. Does it matter? Yes. Have you ever heard of that? Contact angle or wetting angle. Some particles are supposed to be wetting better than some other particle. And when do you say a particle is wetting better? When the angle is higher or lower? When the angle is smaller. For example, if the contact angle is 0, we say that is best wetting condition. And if you remember, again, if I draw the heterogeneous nucleation concept for you, if you say there is a particle, there is a solid nucleating out of a liquid, you talk about different interfacial energies, solid liquid interfacial energy and solid particle interfacial energies and liquid particle interfacial energies. Have you seen this kind of a thing? Everything is told. It's a question of whether we retain it or not, whether we decide to retain it or not. So this, if we do an equilibrium of this, we say there is an equilibrium between all this, which I can write it as gamma LP is equal to gamma SP plus gamma SL cos theta, right? Where this is theta. And so as a result, I can write cos theta as gamma LP minus gamma SP by gamma S. And we say that when the theta is very small, it is very good wetting. Okay, completely wet. This just spreads. Even for example, if you take a glass surface and put a water droplet, it just stays as a droplet. It doesn't just spread. When it spreads, we say it wets. Take a oil and drop it on a surface, you see it just stays as a droplet. If it spreads, then we say yes, it is wetting. If it does not spread, this is how we call it as hydrophobic, hydrophilic, right? So now if you look at this equation is the crux of the whole heterogeneous nucleation. It tells you if you want the theta to be smaller, you want the cos theta to be larger, right? Good wetting means what? If a particle has to be a good wetting with the liquid so that the nucleation can take place. I will tell you the physical meaning of it a little later. What you need is a larger cos theta. When do you get a larger cos theta? Either gamma LP has to increase or gamma SP has to be lower. Gamma SL is not related to any particle. Gamma SL is the interfacial energy between solid and liquid. That has nothing to do with whether you have added particle or you have not added particle, right? So if you have added particle, what gets affected is only this. This is something where particle is coming into picture. There is no particle in this, right? So wherever gamma SP is small, then you will see those cases are the ones where you have a better wetting. What do I mean by smaller gamma SP? That means the interfacial energy between the particle and the solid should be smaller. When is this possible? When is this possible? When do you have a small interfacial energy between solid and particle? Yeah, theta is not. Theta is actually not 180. Theta is 180 is no wetting at all. Theta 180 is this, madam. Theta 0 is this. This is theta is 180. This is theta is 0. My question is to have theta close to 0, cos theta. When theta equal to 0, then cos theta is 1. Right? Please sit down. So if I want theta to be smaller, cos theta has to be larger. And if I want cos theta to be larger, gamma SP has to be smaller. My question is, when do you get gamma SP smaller? Under what conditions gamma SP will be smaller? It has to have something to do with solid and particle. Large particle size, particle surface area. Not really. Surface area and surface energy are not always connected. We are talking of surface energies. Whenever I am talking of surface energy, is per unit area. It's always per unit area. When I say per unit area, you don't need to bother about surface. In fact, if you look at your whole delta G equation, all of you must have remembered, V into delta GV plus A into gamma is what we write, right? And that we write it as 4/3 pi r cube into delta GV plus 4 pi r square into gamma for a spherical nucleus. But the moment it is what is called heterogeneous nucleation, that equation does not work, right? This is only for a homogeneous nucleation. The moment I say heterogeneous nucleation, then here I have to modify this. I have to modify it as V into delta GV, where the V is what? V of this. What is the solid that is nucleating? It is not a sphere anymore. It is only a hemispherical cap. The volume of that. And when I say A is what? A is, here you have a surface area which is being created. So what is the surface area that is being created? If there was no solid originally, there was only a particle inside the liquid. And the particle and the liquid have some surface energy. And that surface, particle surface, is being now replaced with what? A particle solid interface and a solid liquid interface. If I simply have a liquid with a particle inside this, what is the interface that I have? I have only a particle liquid interface before the solidification. Once the solid has nucleated, a solid is nucleated on this. When a solid is nucleated, what is it doing? It is replacing a part of this particle liquid interface with a particle solid interface. Right? Partially, that particular area which was originally exposed to the liquid is now exposed to the solid. Similarly, not only that, now a solid liquid interface is also there. This is a solid liquid interface because liquid is here, solid is here. So one interface is now being replaced with two interfaces. So as a result, in this case, I have to write it as A of gamma LP minus gamma SL plus gamma SP, this kind of a thing. Of course, this A I am simply taking it out, which is actually wrong. You have to have individual areas of each of them to be considered. So one interface is being replaced with two other interfaces. So this was the original, this is the later, and so now the question is whether the solidification will occur or not depends on whether these two put together, if their total interfacial energy is smaller than this or not. If this total interfacial energy of these two, if it is smaller than this, then only nucleation will happen. Otherwise, if there is an increase in the interfacial energy by a solid forming on the particle, there will be no nucleation at all. For example, if there is a particle which has an interface with the liquid originally, and that has certain energy, which I call it as gamma LP, and the new surface that is being created, all this put together. What are the new surfaces? If I put it, one is this surface, that is A of gamma LP, which is the original surface, minus now A of this A LP is equal to the ASP, gamma SP, because it is a spherical, is a circular. If I look at from top, it is a circle, right? That circular area is this minus this whatever is hemispherical cap surface area, that is gamma ASL into gamma SL. This is the overall surface energy. If these two put together values are smaller than this, then there is a decrease in the surface energy. Only when there is a decrease in the surface energy, the solidification will take place. Otherwise, the solidification will not take place. That's why for you to have a good wetting, this has to be smaller than this. If this is not smaller than this, there is no wetting. And when does this become smaller than this? When the solid and particle have some kind of a relation. What is this relation? We say when the solid and particle have similar crystal structures. When the solid onto which particle on which the solid is nucleating, if both of them have the same crystal structure, then the solid can easily nucleate on the surface of the particle. Otherwise, it will not. That's why I cannot take a liquid of, let's say, aluminum and simply go out and take some sand particles, drop it into liquid aluminum, expect them to work as nucleating sites. They will not work. I need to add those particles which have similar crystal structure as that of the solid that is nucleating. What is the solid that is nucleating? It is a FCC aluminum, let us say. So my particle should have similar crystal structure as that of the FCC aluminum. Then the interfacial energy will be very low, because that is when we call it as epitaxy. epitaxial growth. So gamma sp will be lower only then, and when that happens only you will have this. All this is important to understand when you want to understand what kind of sizes are forming. And if I want to know what are the sizes of these grains because of my heterogeneous nucleation, let us say, whenever we do heterogeneous nucleation, we get what is called grain refinement, we say. If I do not do heterogeneous nucleation, I get coarse grain structure. If I do heterogeneous nucleation, I get fine grain structure. And this fine grain and this coarse grain structure, can I quantify? Is what we are going to talk now, and in this particular topic called quantitative metallography. We'll stop here and come back later.